go ahead and start. My name is Timothy Schulz. I'm a cyber adversarial engineer at MITRE, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership and how it applies to InfoSec and technical professions in general. So as far as the inspiration for this talk, so leadership has always been a passion of mine. It's something that I wouldn't consider myself an expert in, but it's still something that I really enjoy either reading books or just understanding more on the topic. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if there were more conferences and speakers that talked about leadership? And so I was looking for some, and I found a few resources. But I kind of vented on Twitter that I was hoping for more resources. And one of my coworkers, Sarah, challenged me to be the change that I wanted to see and to actually give a talk on it. And so that's sort of the overall inspiration for this is Sarah, so I want to give her a quick shout out. So if there's one idea I want everyone in here to walk away with, it's that anyone can be a leader. And so what do I mean by this? A lot of people, when they think about leadership, think of it as positional. You have to be a manager. You have to be somebody that has people under you, that report to you. Leadership is influence. And so whether that's helping a junior member of your team with a tough problem that they've had, and maybe they don't even report directly to you, that's something that anyone at any level of an organization can still be effective with. And so that's the one idea I really want everyone in here to walk away with if you don't hear anything else. So a common question with leadership is, where do you start? There's a lot of really great books out there, and there's thousands of them. Everyone's written a book on leadership, and I've read a bunch of them. A lot of them are good, some of them are okay, but these are sort of the 3 points that I would like to get across if someone, when people come to me and ask, how would you start in leadership? And the first one is get involved. Second is get humbled. And the third is getting feedback. And we're going to dive into each of these. So the first is getting involved. So what does it mean to get involved? I'm talking about looking for leadership positions and that influence that I talked about outside of work. That's one way to do it. Obviously, inside of work is best because then you can actually apply the leadership you're learning in your field. But leadership transcends specific fields, and that's where if you want to work on something that, for instance, in cybersecurity, you wanted to apply or learn leadership while still applying your technical expertise, you have things like Cyber Patriot, CCDC, Girls Who Code. Those are all organizations, or as I should mention, BSidesCharm, a local security conference that has awesome volunteers that were here setting up on Friday. And so those are all opportunities that you can take outside of your work that will still benefit your leadership building. So learning to follow is another really important one. This is where it's about identifying the leadership traits that you find important, that you hopefully you enjoy being led by good leaders. And so understanding what leadership traits within yourself, what you value, and how people can use those effectively are all things that you always want to be assessing as you work through your projects, as you work within teams. And so with this, networking is vital to success. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more later, but that's sort of a baseline. You need to have a large sphere of influence, people you know, to help you solve problems. And so this, to sort of touch on information security, we often have a lot of turnover. Every few years, you'll have people leave, you'll have new people come in, and it's important to keep in touch with people even after they leave. It doesn't have to be a lot, just sort of exchange contact info. I know whenever I have coworkers leave, they'll send out a final email out to everyone with their personal email and say, hey, reach out. And I did the same thing when I switched jobs, and I can count on one hand the number of people that have reached out since. But that's something to just sort of keep in mind, is that you always want to sort of keep an eye on each person that you interact with, because they might be your entry to another job, or they might help you solve a tough problem in the future. So I said we were going to get into networking, and now we're going to dive into that. So why is networking important? Well, a good sort of guide here is treating every interaction like a job interview. And so I say this as a guide instead of maybe a rule, because this is tough to keep up whenever you're talking to a lot of people, for instance, at a conference, and it's a lot of work, frankly, to try and do that every time. So that's why I say it's more of a guideline than an actual rule. But businesses work through relationships. This industry works through relationships, and so as you interact with people, I know that's something that I've encountered in my position is I am not good at things like reverse engineering or cryptography, but I know people that are. And so whenever I encounter an issue with one of those areas, or maybe I need a software engineering team, or I need someone that's better, that knows the financials of how our company works, those are all people that I've built relationships with so that whenever I have a problem, I can give them a call. And so teams overall do better than individuals. We all work on either CTF problems here, or occasionally at work we'll get maybe a challenge that we're the only one that's really contributing to. But I'd argue that those are more the exception rather than the rule. Most of the times you're working with people, or the reason you're working on one of those problems is to enable someone else. And so that's why you need to be a good team player, and as a leader you need to know how to foster good teams. And so the last point I want to talk about here is how people open up their network to you. I talked about how I know the reverse engineers, and I know someone that's good at cryptography. And so even if they're not this person that's going to solve my issue with either of those fields, there's still someone that I can talk to that will know the people within their field that might be able to solve my problem. So the networks sort of continue to expand, and that's why it's super important to continue to build relationships. So talking about networking, if you're an introvert in the room, maybe you got a little bit tense when you heard that, hey, networking is really important, and this is something that you're going to need to jump into. Well, that's when I'm talking about networking, it's more about building relationships than anything. It's not necessarily the corporate banquet that has 300 people and you need to go work the room and talk to everybody. So there are a couple different ways that you can sort of approach this. One is to make your conversations with people one-on-ones. That helps, whether that's going out to lunch or just having a conversation maybe, off to the side of a large group of people. That can make it easier to sort of have those connections without having to talk to an entire group. So I say bring food, right? Have a candy bowl. In my previous office, we had a Dorito bar. And I'm not kidding when I say we had 6 different types of Doritos that people could all come and partake in. And so our office at times became almost rowdy with the number of people that were in it. So it was sometimes tough to get, real work done. But it provided this area, this community that I got to know a lot of people through their time spent when they would just come in to get a few Doritos, and 20 minutes later we were still chatting. So this going to lunch is another one. I sort of highlighted that as far as the one-on-ones, but especially when starting a new job, this was something that I encountered almost a year ago, was I switched jobs. And so the team went out to lunch every day. So I went out to lunch every day to sort of get to know them, to see what their hobbies were and whatever they're willing to share with me. And that was sort of important for the team building aspect. And even if you're not going to eat what they do, right? People have different diets, that kind of thing. But just going out and having those conversations outside of work, it does help build those relationships within your team. So, and that's where, you keep hearing me talk about building relationships. These are all about having I'll call it a real connection with people. And that's whether that's remembering what their specific hobbies are, or whether or not they are, attending a conference, or how something went. All of those types of questions, and especially remembering the answers to those, are really important, will help continue to build your network and relationships. So, networking for extroverts. This is something that most extroverts would maybe work a room, they'd be really comfortable building out their network, but especially if you are an extrovert, and you're in a technical field, you're going to run into introverts. And so you should use the previous slide as sort of a guidebook on what you should do to help enable your conversations with those introverts. And so part of that is, for instance, silence is golden. That's really hard for me. And so I like to fill silence with words, and they might not mean anything, but that's just, I like to fill. And so that's something I've had to adjust whenever I'm talking to somebody, and I sort of identify, okay, I'm sort of dominating this conversation because I'm just talking. And so make sure you have pauses, slow down, ask questions, and they shouldn't just be sort of meaningless questions that you're just waiting for the answer to come so you can jump back in. You need to actually engage with the people that you're talking with. Try, like I said, remembering those small details is really important because it shows that you were actually listening to someone when you talked to them earlier. And so they'll remember, oh, hey, I can't believe I told so-and-so about this hobby, and they remembered it 3 months later. So it means a lot. And I like a Stephen Covey quote here, which is, seek to understand before being understood. So kind of conveys it pretty simply. And that moves us into getting humble. So just because you are a technical expert does not transition quite so easily into being a leadership expert. One does not always equal the other. You can be a technical expert and an expert or a great leader, but there's still skills that have to be worked on independently. So you wouldn't expect someone who was fresh out of school maybe to be an expert C++ coder. You would expect them to build that over years of experience, and the same thing should be said of soft skills in general, but leadership especially. It's something that needs to be developed. You're going to have to try things out. You're going to have to learn how you develop as a leader, and then you're going to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. It's all right. And you're going to iterate on that. And so we'll sort of get into the feedback part of that in a minute. So the next part of getting humble is learning from others. Everyone is a teacher, including yourself. So what you're learning from each individual is, you can sort of categorize it. If you're under a bad leader, if you're under people you don't agree with, try and figure out why, right? Is it a behavior? Is it their outlook on things? Those all will inform you on how you can be a good leader later, because maybe you are looking at a project and you don't agree with how it's being managed. That's something I take notes, and I say, all right, so now whenever I become a project manager or I'm running something, I go back to that list and say, were all my pet peeves that I had on other project leads, and to make sure that I don't do the same things. So that's another thing that's important in this, is just because someone isn't a technical expert in your field doesn't mean that they can't contribute to your project in some way. So this is especially important in today's world, where teams are more diverse, as diverse as ever, and it's interdisciplinary. You need people from all sorts of different backgrounds to help solve some of these really complex problems that we're talking about today. And so if you're not able to humble yourself to get to a point where just because they don't have the exact same background and expertise as you, that you can't have a conversation or can't work with them, that's going to be a huge inhibitor to your leadership and just your career in general. So knowing yourself. This is sort of a lead into some feedback, but learning how you communicate and how you respond to other styles of communication is really important. How we communicate is, I feel like, well, for social engineers, you have a breakdown of nonverbals versus what you say. And so I don't remember the exact percentages, but a large part of communication is in like body language and understanding how the other person's responding to you. So a way to look at this, as sort of framework, I'll say, is DISC. You may have heard of it, and it classifies communication styles into four different categories. And depending on where you are in that, it's going to influence how you communicate with those other three parts. Now, it's great to do this individually because it's a self-assessment to some degree. And as with a lot of these sort of leadership tests, they are self-assessments. And so you have to try and be as honest with yourself as you can when you go through them, because otherwise, your answers are not going to, they're not going to give you as good of information. So the cool thing about DISC and some of that is what I've done in the past is done this as a team. And so everyone takes it individually, and then you get together. And so the key thing here is, because it is a self-assessment, I see how others view themselves. And it completely changed the way I communicated with one member of the team, because I never saw them as analytical as they were. And so that's where the power of taking these and seeing how you communicate versus how they view your communications is important. And so that meant that whenever I talked to them or looked for their advice in the future, it's very deliberate with how I made that communication to match with their style, so that we didn't have to jump around something, because sometimes I add a bunch of filler words or something like that. They wanted straight to the point. So that's sort of a quick example of that. And then the last point is getting feedback. So feedback can be intimidating, especially when you're going and asking for it, especially if you're worried about it being negative. So that's where I recommend starting with trusted peers here, people that you know will give you the good and the bad, if that's really what it comes down to. And so that's something that I want to touch on as far as the give and take with feedback. So getting feedback gives you additional data points in how you're doing, how other people view you, and just like when we receive negative feedback, it maybe tense up a little bit. Getting positive feedback feels great. Whenever we go, you look on Amazon, the 5-star reviews, right, are what everyone wants. But that's where I feel like while we like receiving good feedback, how often do people give it out? It's just as important when you're giving feedback as a leader to give out positive feedback in addition to changes that need to be made. So this is where iterative feedback is much more important than maybe a once a year or once every quarter, depending on how your performance review system works. And iterative feedback allows you to tackle small problems as they arise in teams, instead of having something fester and get to a point where, the worst case is someone gets fired because there was a behavior or there was something that wasn't addressed early on. So to give a story here, one of my English teachers back in undergraduate would give the score to your paper and say, we can talk about this score, but we have to wait 24 hours. And so that was to let people calm down, especially if they got a score they didn't like. And so this is where if you're somebody that takes feedback, especially negatively, maybe you get angry because you felt like that was uncalled for, because feedback is personal, and you're asking for someone's opinion on how you're doing. And so that's why I say try not to take it personally, especially the first few times when you're trying to build a feedback loop, because if you react super negatively the first time, then people are less likely to give it to you more often, because they're like, I don't want so-and-so to get mad at me, made the team environment bad for 2 months, and or we never recovered. So that's something just to keep in mind, is that say thank you and then walk away. And you can mull it over, and you can go think about it, and then you can sort of come back. So as far as getting feedback, we've talked about you have your self-assessments, you have your trusted peers you've gone and asked. Now your peers might also be giving you formal feedback. They might be feeding into information that your boss or the team lead is also going to be giving you as part of maybe your performance reviews. And so that's where you want to create this culture of feedback where people are addressing these problems. A healthy team is someone that can tackle all of the small things as they come up, whether they're good or bad. And so if you're looking for more formal methods of feedback, for instance, there's a 360-degree is a common feedback mechanism that looks at the people that you're working for, the people you're working with, and it tries to get a bunch of different angles of feedback on you. And so a lot of times it's good to have a coach or a mentor that will help work you through this process, because getting feedback from people can be difficult, especially if it's not part of their job. And that's why I again tie back to having a culture of feedback, so that you'll get feedback even unsolicited, and you're not going to have to hunt people down and sit with them and try, and maybe that is a more intimidating environment for them. You want to make it easy for them to give you feedback. So a quick little framework on how you can start with feedback. People have heard of the compliment sandwich, right? Where you maybe give a quick compliment, you throw in your negative, and then you end with a compliment. Hopefully that softened the blow. Well, start, stop, and continue is sort of a, we'll call it a similar method, but it's something that's meant to be done on a regular basis, say every 30 to 60 days. And so I've sat down with project leads and had this conversation that I'm looking for feedback. I want to address things if there are issues that arise. I want to address them early and often. And so I want 1 to 2 things to stop doing, 1 to 2 things to start doing, and 1 to 2 things to continue doing. So this gives them specific things when they are giving you feedback, specific goals for the feedback. Because oftentimes, if you sat down with somebody right now and said, "Hey, give me some feedback," they'd say, "Oh, you're doing fine, doing good." What does that tell you? It doesn't tell you anything. You know, that maybe confirmed what you already thought, like, "Hey, I'm awesome." But you really want to get constructive feedback. It's really important, and this helps create that framework for it. So for example, some feedback maybe I've gotten is the 2 things to stop having brainstorms early in the morning in our office because I can't get things done. Start engaging with sponsors more often because you're good at that, and we want to make sure that they are able to connect with you and the rest of the team. And then continue to engage in hiring and recruiting process because that's something that we've seen direct benefits from. So, a quick review of the 3 points: getting involved, getting humble, and getting feedback. Any questions? Thank you.